talk a lot about, how the government is using and investing in open source. Were you part of the group of people who set this up, or was open source already in use by the government by the time you got there?
See, the government has been trying to use, and I'm saying trying to use open source because a lot of the time they were developing their platforms using open source frameworks. But a lot of these frameworks or platforms, they were actually um, in control of a third party. So the vendor that actually developed the technology generally was the one that controlled and knew how everything was. So when we went into agriculture, we tried to do things a little bit differently. And we actually made it that whatever was developed by the software fabrics that were being hired to do these developments would actually become part of the agency's goods. No, and that's something that kind of like carried on. Um, I served during two different presidential terms. So that presidential terms spoke about the use of open source vaguely, and they recognized the power of using cloud technology, and that was accepted on a legal basis for personal data. But that was pretty much it. So it wasn't until the Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador government came into power that actually open source became part of the agenda. I was fortunate enough that during the transition process of government, I was able to meet them, and they saw the work we had done in regards to open source at the Ministry of Agriculture, and they invited me to stay on. And it was with them that we were able to do some really great projects. But it was also with them that legislation started to change. So, for example, there was this whole idea, of like, let's reduce costs. There was a austerity plan that was launched. So that was a very big, important part of seeing how we could apply this austerity plan to technology as well. And there was a lot about talking about technology sovereignty and creating our own capacities in the government, not only in regards to technology, but also in regards to talent. And this is why like these programs in open source development and cybersecurity were very important, that the government actually started these programs in order to get younger people to start launching into these kind of topics. Like I mentioned, we wanted to transition from an IT consumer to being an IT generator, but that's when like the legislation came in, and this legislation that's very clear. It's still part of the law right now. So if we, for example, if we talk about one of the pieces of legislation, it was the kind of like the policies and the guidelines that were issued by this agency in the presidential office about how the administration do digital government and the procurements. It actually says that institutions may implement open source software. And this was kind of like done because it was always like this kind of thing, like, oh, we can't do it, no? Then there was also the General Law for Humanity, Science, and Technology that again spoke about digital sovereignty and this technology being able to be open source. And then on the actual austerity legislation, it said that agencies should promote the use of open source when possible. So I think this was a very big game changer. And for policy people around the world, I think this is a good example about how Mexico has been able to actually regulate in favor of, and this doesn't mean that like big, complicated like satellite systems and security systems have to be open source. There's still space for those to be private because they're highly specialized. But basic things that can actually be built in-house and that can help you reduce costs and get that cost spent otherwise, that's kind of like the things that are being promoted. So it was really this past 6 years that have just finished in October, the ones that were pushing forward this agenda. Because it was policy, then that meant that a lot of the government agencies had to go that way. There was also a lot of work done in changing CTO's mindsets and decision makers, because a lot of the time you hear open source and everybody goes, oh, open source, it's open, it's free, it's cheap, it doesn't work. or it's not safe. So we did a lot of work in kind of like making people understand like what's the process in designing an open source solution, like from the definition of the requirement to the actual development of the platform, the testing, the cybersecurity analysis, everything that took place in order to be able to put it in front of a public service official or a citizen, and be able to get them to understand how all these processes and kind of like the benefits and all these kind of things. At the end of the day, most of the times, I think when you're talking about these open source implementations or any technological implementations, from my experience, I've discovered that it's never a tech problem. It's generally a people problem, and it's always a change management problem. So that's kind of like always the big challenge. But I think we moved forward really, really well in Mexico. A lot of agencies have started using open source technology. And I think that speaks that these kind of like regulations were beneficial for us. And that has redirected a whole lot of the budget that was before spent on these expensive licensing and these multinational companies that generally don't give anything back to the country. Into other things because there's never enough money in government. So always when you can spare a couple of dollars here and there, that makes a big difference somewhere else.